The metayage system is the cultivation of land for a proprietor by one who receives a proportion of the produce, as a kind of sharecropping. Another class of land tenancy in France is named fermage, whereby the rent is paid annually in banknotes. Origin and function. Metayage was available under Roman law, although it was not in widespread use. It proved useful after the emancipation of Roman slaves, as the newly freed peasants had no land to cash. In what is now northern Italy and southeastern France, the post-Black Death population explosion of the late Middle Ages combined with the relative lack of free land made metayage an attractive system for both landowner and farmer. Once institutionalized, it continued long into the 18th century, although the base causes had been relieved by emigration to the New World. Metayage was used early in the Middle Ages in northern France and the Rhinelands, where burgeoning prosperity encouraged large-scale vineyard planting, similar to what the ancient Romans had accomplished utilizing slave labor. The hyperinflation that followed the influx of ink and American gold made metayage preferable to cash tenancy and wage labor for both parties. Called complant, a laborer would offer to plant and tend to an uncultivated parcel of land belonging to a landowner. The preanger would have ownership of the vines and the baler would receive anywhere from a third to two-thirds of the vine's production in exchange for the use of his soil. This system was used extensively in planting the Champagne region. Baler was also used as the name for the proprietor under metayage. The contract still exists today in Switzerland. In the 18th century c. 75% of leased lands in western, southern and central France were sharecropped. North of the Loire it was only common in Lorraine. In Italy and France, respectively, it was called mezzadria and metayage, or halving, the halving, that is, of the produce of the soil between landowner and landholder. Halving didn't imply equal amounts of the produce but rather division according to agreement. The produce was divisible in certain definite proportions, which obviously must have varied with the varying fertility of the soil and other circumstances, and did in practice vary so much that the landlord's share was sometimes as much as two-thirds, sometimes as little as one-third. Sometimes the landlord supplied all the stock, sometimes only part, the cattle and seed perhaps, while the farmer provided the implements, or perhaps only half the seed and half the cattle, the farmer finding the other halves. Thus the instrumentum fundi of Roman law was combined within metayage. Taxes were also frequently divided, being paid wholly by one or the other, or jointly by both. In the 18th century, metayage agreements began to give way to agreements to share profits from the sale of the crops and to straight tenant farming, although the practice in its original form could still be found in isolated communities until the early 20th century. By 1929, there were still 200,000 metaires farming 11% of French cultivated land. It was most common in lands analia. As the metayage practice changed, the term colonat partiaire began to be applied to the old practice of sharing out the actual crop, while metayage was used for the sharing out of the proceeds from the sale of the crops. Colonat partiaire was still practiced in the French overseas departments, notably Aire-Coute Union, until 2006 when it was abolished. In France there was also a system termed metayage par groups, which consisted of letting a sizable farm not to one metaire but to an association of several who would work together for the general good under the supervision of either the landlord or his bailiff. This arrangement got past the difficulty of finding tenants having sufficient capital and labor to run the larger farms. In France, since 1983, these metayage and similar farming contracts have been regulated by livre IV of the rural code. Localities. The system was once universal in certain provinces of Italy and France, and survived there in places until the end of the 19th century. Similar systems formerly existed in Portugal, Castile, and in Greece, and in the countries bordering on the Danube. It is tracked to this day in statistics of the European Commission. Metayage was used in French colonies, particularly after the demise of slavery. Also, because of its utility, metayage spread to nearby British colonies such as Nevis, St. Lucia and Tobago. It still occurs in former French possessions, particularly in Madagascar. In the Congo, the system is used in the vicinity of Kahuzi-Bié National Park as a means to protect the natural environment. In Mexico, the system is used in animal husbandry. The term metayage is also applied to modern-day flexible cash leases, at least in the nominally common-law Canadian province of Ontario. And in 2006, in all of Canada, 13,030 farms occupying 2,316,566 hectares were counted by Statistics Canada. The same study of Metayage found 2,489 farms covering 130,873 hectares in Ontario. The system was useful in Quebec for most agricultural properties at least as far back as the year 1800, and is still tracked statistically by value in Quebec as lawyer NESPECESETALA Part. Agriculture. It appears to benefit from favorable tax treatment in Canada, where it is known as sharecropping. In forestry, metayage is the subject of the Government of Canada info sheet and socio-economic report, and has been the subject in Quebec of recent scholarly research. Criticism. British writers were unanimous in condemning the metayage system, until John Stuart Mill adopted a different tone. They judged it by its appearance in France, where under the ancient regime all direct taxes were paid by the metayer, with the noble landowner being exempt, with the taxes being assessed according to the visible produce of the soil. They operated as penalties upon productiveness. Under this system, a metayer could fancy that his interest lay less in exerting himself to augment the total share to be divided between himself and his landlord, and instead be encouraged to defraud the latter part of his rightful share. This was partly due to the metayer's relative state of destitution, and with the fixed duration of his tenure, without which the metayage could not prosper. French metayers in Arthur Young's time were removable at pleasure and obliged to conform in all things to the will of the landlords, and so in general they still remain. In 1600, the landlord Olivier de Serres wrote Le Traité de l'Agriculture, which recommends metayage as cash tenants to all the risks would demand. Lower rent while hard labor was expensive to manage. Simon de Sismondi expressed dissatisfaction in 1819 with the institution of metayage because it reinforced the poverty of the peasants and prevented any social or cultural development. Yet even in France, although metayage and extreme rural poverty usually coincided, there were provinces where the contrary was the case, as it also was in Italy, especially on the plains of Lombardy. An explanation of the contrasts presented by metayage in different regions is not far to seek. Metayage, in order to be in any measure worthy of commendation, must be a genuine partnership, one in which there is no sleeping partner but in the affairs of which the landlord, as well as the tenant, takes an active part. Wherever this applied, the results of metayage appeared to be as eminently satisfactory, as they were decidedly the reverse wherever the landlords held themselves aloof.